Shaq was enjoying a quiet morning on his porch, coffee in hand, when a mountain of garbage appeared on his driveway. Flies swarmed, the stench was unbearable, and his neighbor Margaret Hamilton stood smirking from across the street. Instead of losing his temper, Shaq smiled, because he had a plan. What he did next didn't just humiliate her. It turned her life upside down and transformed her hate into something the world would never forget. Stay until the end, because this story will leave you speechless. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Shaq stretched his arms as he stepped out onto his porch, a steaming cup of coffee in his massive hand. The morning was crisp, the sky painted with soft hues of orange and pink. It was supposed to be a peaceful start to his day. But the moment his eyes landed on his driveway, his expression darkened. A mountain of garbage, rotten food, ripped newspapers, empty wine bottles, was scattered right in front of his garage. The stench hit him instantly, making him wince. Flies buzzed around, feasting on the mess. Shaq let out a slow breath, trying to keep his cool. He took a step closer, nudging a greasy pizza box with his shoe. His housekeeper, Maria, appeared at the door, her hands on her hips. "Senor Shaq, I think I know who did this." Shaq arched an eyebrow. "Oh, yeah?" Maria folded her arms. "Margaret Hamilton." The name didn't ring a bell. Shaq frowned, taking another sip of his coffee. "Who?" Maria sighed, glancing around like she expected someone to be listening. "She lives 2 houses down, old money. Thinks she owns this whole neighborhood." She pointed at the security cameras mounted on the side of Shaq's house. "I bet we caught her red-handed." Shaq pulled out his phone, accessing the security footage. Within seconds, his frown deepened. There she was, Margaret Hamilton, a petite elderly woman, dressed in an expensive nightgown, hauling bags of trash from the back of her car. She moved with surprising energy for her age, tossing garbage onto Shaq's driveway with a smug little smirk. Shaq let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Man, she really thought she did something," Maria huffed. "She's been causing problems for years, complains about everything, calls the HOA over the smallest things. But this?" She gestured at the mess. "This is a new low." Shaq set his coffee cup down on the porch railing. His towering frame straightened. "All right," he said, rolling his shoulders. "Let's see what she has to say for herself." He strode down the driveway, stepping over the trash, and made his way to Margaret's house. The grand white mansion stood behind an iron gate, a pristine contrast to the mess she had just created. Shaq rang the doorbell. Silence. He rang again, this time knocking firmly on the heavy oak door. Footsteps shuffled inside. The peephole darkened. Someone was looking through it. Then, without a word, the door slammed shut. Shaq smirked, shaking his head. "Oh, this is gonna be fun." Shaq wasn't the type to back down, and he definitely wasn't the type to let things slide. Standing in front of Margaret Hamilton's pristine white mansion, he rang the doorbell again, this time with a little more force. Silence. Shaq smirked. "I know you're in there, lady," he called out, his deep voice carrying through the door. "Might as well open up before I start knocking louder." A few beats passed before the lock clicked, and the door creaked open just enough for him to see a sharp pair of blue eyes glaring up at him. Margaret Hamilton stood there, dressed in a silk robe, her silver hair in a perfect tight bun. She had an air of arrogance about her, like someone who believed the world was beneath her. "What do you want?" she snapped, crossing her arms. Shaq tilted his head toward his driveway. "Guessing this was your idea of a housewarming gift?" Margaret scoffed. "If I were you, I'd be grateful I didn't call the HOA first. People like you don't belong here." Shaq felt his jaw tighten. He had dealt with all kinds of people in his life, but there was something particularly entertaining about watching a tiny, bitter old woman act like she owned the world. He folded his arms, his massive frame towering over her. "Oh, I'd love to meet the HOA, he said, his grin widening. "Matter of fact, why don't we call them right now? Bet they'd love to hear about this little stunt." Margaret's smirk faltered for just a second before she scoffed again. "You think you can intimidate me?" Shaq shook his head. "Nah, I think you're already intimidated. That's why you're acting out." Margaret's lips curled in disgust. "This neighborhood has standards. People like me have built it up for decades. And then people like you show up and think you can just buy your way in." Shaq let out a low chuckle. "That's usually how buying a house works, lady." Margaret's face burned red. "You think this is funny?" "Oh, I think it's hilarious." Shaq said. See, you thought I was just going to roll over and take this. But I don't play like that. Margaret's glare sharpened, but before she could snap back, she simply exhaled sharply and slammed the door in his face. Shaq stood there for a moment, then let out a deep laugh. All right, lady, you want to play? Let's play. As he turned away, he caught a glimpse of movement from the second-story window. Margaret was standing there watching him, a sly smirk curling on her lips. This wasn't over. Not even close. The sun had barely begun to rise when Shaq stepped outside, stretching his arms as he inhaled the crisp morning air. But just as he took a step forward, his expression darkened. Another massive pile of garbage was scattered across his driveway. Rotten food, torn newspapers, plastic bags, and even broken eggshells lay strewn across the pavement, the stench already starting to rise. Maria, his housekeeper, stood a few feet away, arms crossed, shaking her head in disbelief. You have got to be kidding me, she muttered. Again, Shaq exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temple. Looks like our little friend had another late-night visit. Just then, one of his security guards jogged up, holding a tablet. Boss, you're going to want to see this, he said, pulling up the security footage. Shaq squinted at the screen. The grainy black and white video showed Margaret sneaking onto his property under the cover of darkness. Wearing a long nightgown and slippers, she gleefully dumped bag after bag of trash onto his driveway. And then, the kicker, she actually cackled as she waddled back to her house. Maria's face turned red. Oh, she thinks this is funny. Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. Looks like she's enjoying herself. She's doing this every night at 3 a.m., the security guard added. We checked the logs. This is the third night in a row. Maria threw her hands up. She thinks she's untouchable. Shaq let out a deep, rumbling laugh. Not for long. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and scrolled through his contacts. A mischievous smirk played on his lips as he tapped the screen and put the phone to his ear. Hey, I need a favor, he said. Maria raised an eyebrow. Who are you calling? Shaq's smirk widened. Someone who's about to give Margaret a little surprise of her own. As he spoke across the street, Margaret Hamilton peered through her curtains, watching with narrowed eyes. She saw the mess she had made. She saw Shaq standing there, phone in hand, looking completely unfazed. And for the first time since she started this little game, she felt something unsettling, a nagging feeling in her gut. Like maybe, just maybe, she had underestimated the man across the street. Shaq leaned against his truck, arms crossed, staring at the mess in his driveway. He had dealt with haters before, but this was something else. Margaret Hamilton wasn't just petty, she was committed. But Shaq wasn't about to waste his time in a childish back and forth. He didn't play dirty, he played smart. With a calm smirk, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts before tapping on a familiar name. The line rang twice before a smooth voice answered. David Reynolds, top-tier real estate. What can I do for you, Mr. O'Neill? Shaq's grin widened. Hey, David, I got a question for you. Always a pleasure. What's on your mind? Shaq glanced across the street at Margaret's pristine, ivy-covered mansion. How much is Margaret Hamilton's house worth? There was a brief silence on the other end, then a quiet chuckle. You looking to buy, Shaq? Maybe, Shaq replied casually. Depends on the price. David sighed. That's an interesting choice. I'll be honest. On paper, it's a beautiful property. Big house, great location. But, Shaq's ears perked up. But what? She's in deep debt, David admitted. Her estate looks fancy, but she's been bleeding money for years. The maintenance costs, property taxes. Let's just say she's holding on by a thread. Shaq let out a low whistle. So you're telling me, if someone were to put the right offer on the table, she wouldn't have much of a choice? David chuckled. With the right price? Anything's possible. Shaq's grin turned into something sharper, more calculated. Margaret had spent all this time making his life miserable, thinking she was untouchable. But she wasn't. She was vulnerable, and she had no idea. All right, David, Shaq said, pushing off his truck. Make her an offer she can't refuse. Margaret had played her game. Now it was Shaq's turn. David laughed. This is gonna be interesting. Margaret Hamilton had always believed she was untouchable. From her high-backed velvet chair, sipping her morning tea, she enjoyed looking out over the neighborhood she had controlled for decades. But this morning, something was different. A thick envelope sat on her doorstep. It was stamped with an official seal, the kind that immediately made her stomach twist. With a huff, she bent down, snatched it up, and tore it open. Her eyes scanned the first line, then the second, and then her breath caught in her throat. An offer had been placed on her house, and not just any offer. This was a number so large it made her fingers tremble, the kind of money that could wipe out her debts in an instant. Margaret's heart pounded. No, 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 she muttered, gripping the letter like it might disappear if she just willed it hard enough. Who would do this? And why now? She fumbled for her phone and punched in her realtor's number, her hands shaking. Hello, Margaret, the voice on the other end answered, cheerful as ever. Cut the pleasantries, Judith, Margaret snapped. What the hell is this letter about? A pause. Ah, so you saw the offer. Of course I saw it, she hissed. Tell me this is a mistake. Judith cleared her throat. It's no mistake, Margaret. The offer is real, and frankly, given your financial situation, I think you should consider it. Margaret's face turned red. I'm not selling my house, especially not like this. Who the hell would... She stopped, suddenly suspicious. Who made the offer, Judith? Silence. Margaret's grip on the phone tightened. Judith, I swear if you don't tell me... Judith let out a sigh. You're not gonna like the answer. Margaret's world is about to come crashing down. Margaret Hamilton's hands trembled with rage as she slammed her car door shut. The tires screeched as she peeled out of her driveway, heading straight for the real estate office. Her breath was ragged, her knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel. This had to be a mistake, a sick joke. Someone was trying to humiliate her. Moments later, she stormed through the glass doors of Hamilton and Associates Realty, her designer heels clicking violently against the marble floor. The receptionist barely had time to greet her before Margaret's voice rang through the office. Where's Judith? She snapped, eyes blazing. Judith, the real estate agent who had handled Margaret's affairs for years, emerged from her office, arms crossed, already expecting this meltdown. Margaret, I was going to call... Margaret shoved the crumpled letter in her face. Who the hell is trying to buy my house? Judith took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. Margaret, you need to calm down. Margaret's nostrils flared. Do I look like I need to calm down? She shrieked. Tell me who it is. Judith hesitated for a moment, then sighed. A Mr. O'Neill. Margaret's brow furrowed. O'Neill? Judith gave her a pointed look. You may know him as Big Shaq. For a moment there was silence, a brief, eerie pause where the reality of the situation sank in. And then Margaret let out a piercing, frustrated scream that made the entire office freeze. That overgrown bully is trying to buy my house? She spat, her voice cracking. This is harassment. It's criminal. Judith merely raised an eyebrow. No, Margaret, it's business. Furious, Margaret spun on her heel and stormed out, practically knocking over a poor intern in her path. She fumbled for her car keys with shaking hands, rage boiling inside her. This wasn't over. Not even close. By the time she screeched to a stop in front of her house, she barely noticed the unfamiliar cars parked along the curb. But when she stepped out, her stomach dropped. A team of inspectors was already on her lawn, clipboards in hand, surveying her property like they owned it. One man was tapping the brick wall, another scribbled notes on a report. Margaret's jaw clenched. What the hell is going on here? She shrieked. Then from across the yard, a deep chuckle echoed. She turned her head sharply. There he was, Big Shaq, standing in her yard, arms crossed, a smug grin on his face. And then, to make matters worse, he waved at her. Margaret's war with Shaq has officially begun. Margaret Hamilton gritted her teeth as she stormed back into her house, slamming the door behind her. Her chest heaved with anger, her hands shaking as she grabbed her phone. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. She scrolled through her contacts and hit dial. The line rang twice before a voice answered. Margaret, came a tired sigh. What now? Don't you what now me, Thomas, she snapped. Did you know that someone, him, is trying to buy my house? There was a pause, then her lawyer, Thomas Reynolds, cleared his throat. I, actually just got word of that this morning. It seems an offer was made, a rather generous one. Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. Well, stop it, Thomas sighed again. Margaret, the problem is... What? You already signed the offer letter. The room spun. Margaret grabbed onto the back of a chair to steady herself. That's impossible, she whispered. Thomas continued, his voice cautious. You must have signed it when we were working on refinancing options last month. You probably assumed it was just paperwork for the bank. But in the fine print, it states that if a buyer meets the full asking price, the sale is automatically processed. Margaret's breath came out in short gasps. You're telling me that I sold my own house? By accident? There was an awkward pause. In short, yes. Margaret let out a strangled scream, throwing her phone across the room. It hit the wall with a sharp crack and clattered to the floor. Number, this couldn't be happening. A knock at the door made her freeze. She turned slowly, heart pounding. Through the glass panel, she saw a massive figure standing outside. Margaret clenched her jaw, shoving the door open. What do you want? She spat. Big Shaq stood there, hands in his pockets, his usual smug grin stretched across his face. Just came to check in on my new property. Margaret's face drained of color. Shaq chuckled. Guess I'll be your new landlord, huh? Margaret is out of moves. Or is she? Margaret Hamilton stormed into the community hall, her heels clicking furiously against the polished wooden floor. Her face was flushed with rage, her perfectly styled silver hair slightly disheveled from the whirlwind of emotions. This was her neighborhood, and she was about to make sure everyone knew it. Around the long oak table, the HOA board members sat with weary expressions, already dreading what was coming. Richard Ellis, the HOA president, adjusted his glasses and sighed. Margaret, what's so urgent that you called an emergency meeting? Margaret slammed a stack of papers onto the table, making a few members flinch. This, she screeched, this is what's urgent. That man, Shaquille O'Neal, is ruining our neighborhood. A murmur went through the room. A few exchanged glances, but no one looked particularly shocked. Margaret had always been the first to complain about everything. What exactly has he done? Richard asked, rubbing his temples. Margaret threw up her hands. First he moved in. Now he's buying up property. What's next? A basketball court in the middle of my front yard? She huffed dramatically. This neighborhood was built on class and tradition. People like him don't belong here. The room fell silent. A few members shifted uncomfortably while others looked downright disgusted. Richard leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. Margaret, you're the one who has been breaking rules, harassing neighbors, dumping trash on someone else's property, and now attempting to sabotage a legal home purchase. He tapped the table. Frankly, you're lucky we haven't voted you out of the HOA altogether. Margaret's mouth fell open. This wasn't going how she expected. She opened her mouth to fire back. Then the double doors to the meeting hall swung open. The room turned. Standing in the doorway, towering over everyone, was Big Shaq, and in his massive hands and was a thick legal document. He grinned. Hope I'm not interrupting. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as Shaq casually strolled to the front of the room, placed the papers on the table, and slid them toward Richard. I just wanted to make it official, Shaq said, leaning down slightly so Margaret was forced to meet his eyes. Richard adjusted his glasses and flipped through the document. His eyes widened. This, he muttered, turning pages. This is the deed to Margaret's house. Margaret's knees nearly buckled. Margaret realizes she no longer owns her home. Margaret's fingers trembled as she snatched the deed off the table, her eyes frantically scanning the document for any mistake, any loophole, any way out of this nightmare. But the words were crystal clear. Shaquille O'Neal was now the legal owner of her beloved estate. Her voice came out in a strangled whisper. This can't be real. Shaq, towering over her with his signature grin, leaned down just enough to look her in the eye. Oh, it's real, Margaret. He tapped the document with a massive finger. See that signature at the bottom? That's yours. Margaret felt her stomach lurch. The papers she had hastily signed, believing it was just a routine HOA matter, had actually sealed her fate. She swallowed hard, trying to maintain her composure. You can't do this, Shaq chuckled. Oh, but I already did. He leaned against the table casually, the picture of ease while Margaret looked like she was about to pass out. Now I was thinking, he continued, rubbing his chin as if deep in thought, since I own your house now, maybe I should move in. Margaret's entire body stiffened. The room went dead silent. You wouldn't dare, she hissed, her voice shaking with barely contained rage. Shaq arched a brow. Wouldn't I? He glanced around the room. I mean, it's a big house, plenty of space for me and my people. Maybe I'll put a full-court basketball gym in the backyard. Ooh, how about a music studio? That way I can invite some of my rapper friends over. He smirked as Margaret's face twisted in horror. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She was shaking. Then Shaq leaned in closer, dropping his voice low. Or, you can. Leave. Forever. Margaret stumbled back a step. You, you can't just kick me out. Shaq spread his arms. I can, and I will. You got 30 days to pack. He gave her a slow, amused once-over. But honestly, you might want to start now. Margaret let out a strangled sound, a mixture of disbelief and fury. The weight of her actions, her arrogance, was crashing down all at once. Then, unable to take it any longer, she bolted from the room, her heels clicking wildly against the floor as she pushed past stunned HOA members. Margaret burst through the doors, tears streaming down her face. She has lost everything. Margaret Hamilton had spent her life believing she was untouchable, that her money, status, and last name would shield her from the consequences of her actions. But as she stood in the empty foyer of what was once her grand estate, surrounded by half-packed boxes and the deafening silence of a house no longer hers, reality crashed down like a tidal wave. Her hands trembled as she folded the last of her silk scarves into a suitcase. The once pristine marble floors were now scuffed from hurried footsteps, the grand chandelier above casting dull light over a space that felt smaller than ever. A sharp knock at the door made her flinch. She turned to see her realtor, a solemn expression on his face. "Margaret," he said quietly, "it's time." She wanted to argue, wanted to scream, but she had no fight left in her. She had spent the past week calling every connection she had left, every friend in the community, but no one wanted to be associated with her downfall. She was toxic now. The same people who had smiled at her garden parties now avoided her gaze at the country club. Clutching her designer handbag, she straightened her spine and walked past the realtor without a word. Outside, moving trucks lined the driveway, her once loyal housekeepers packing away expensive furniture they would no longer dust. The sound of cardboard ripping and tape sealing filled the morning air. She reached her car, her trembling fingers fumbling with the keys. As the engine roared to life, she took one last look at her home. Only it wasn't hers anymore. And then she saw it. Across the massive front lawn, a brand new banner hung from the balcony, bold letters standing out against the white walls. Hamilton Community Center. Opening soon. Margaret's breath hitched. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel. Then, as if the universe was delivering its final, crushing blow, the front doors swung open, and out stepped Shaquille O'Neal. He stood tall, arms crossed, watching her with that same amused smirk. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, volunteers bustled around, carrying in school supplies, food donations, and children's books. A group of young kids ran up the steps, excitedly peeking inside their new after-school center. Margaret's stomach twisted. This was her worst nightmare. She had lost her home, her standing in the community, and now, even her legacy. Margaret grips the steering wheel, eyes burning with humiliation. She has nothing left. Margaret sat frozen in the driver's seat, her fingers clutching the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her breathing was shallow, her heart hammering against her chest as she stared at the massive banner hanging from the balcony of what was once her beloved estate. Hamilton Community Center. Opening soon. The words burned into her mind like a cruel joke, a final twist of the knife from the man she had tried so hard to drive away. Her jaw clenched as she forced herself to look away from the banner, only to see something even worse. People. Not the high society elites she had once hosted in her lavish ballroom, but families. Children running up the grand steps with backpacks too large for their small frames. A woman with worn-out shoes carrying bags of donated clothes. A man shaking Shaquille O'Neal's hand with tears in his eyes, mouthing a simple, "Thank you." Margaret's stomach twisted. This was her house, her neighborhood, her legacy, and now it belonged to the very people she had spent her life looking down upon. Her breath came out in short, ragged gasps as she gripped the gear shift, ready to speed away before the humiliation consumed her whole. But before she could, a shadow loomed over her window. She didn't need to look to know who it was. Slowly, reluctantly, she turned her head, and there he was. Shaq stood tall, dressed in a simple black hoodie and jeans, his massive frame casting a shadow over her sleek luxury car. He didn't gloat, he didn't smirk. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable, as if he were waiting for her to understand what had just happened. Margaret's lips trembled, but she refused to let her pride crumble any further. She lifted her chin, hoping to meet his gaze with defiance, but her voice betrayed her. You, you ruined me, she choked out, barely a whisper. Shaq exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. No, Margaret, you did that. Yourself. Her throat tightened, her nails digging into the leather of the steering wheel. She wanted to scream, to demand that this was unfair, to make him understand that people like him didn't belong in places like this. But looking at what her house had become, the smiling faces, the people finding hope where she had once built walls, she knew she had already lost. Shaq took a step back, his expression softening just slightly. Then with a slow, deliberate movement, he raised his hand and waved, a simple, almost casual farewell. Margaret's vision blurred as she slammed her foot on the gas. In her rearview mirror, she sees her house fade into the distance, along with everything she once had. Margaret Hamilton's car screeched to a halt in front of a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of town. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow over the cracked pavement. She sat there for a moment, her hands still gripping the wheel, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The weight of her humiliation pressed down on her like a physical force, suffocating and inescapable. She had lost everything, her home, her status, her pride. And now she was here, in a place she would have once scoffed at, trying to outrun the storm she had created. Inside the diner, the air was thick with the smell of grease and burnt coffee. A few patrons sat scattered in the booths, their conversations low and muffled. Margaret slid into a corner seat, her designer coat starkly out of place against the peeling vinyl. She ordered a black coffee, her voice trembling as she spoke to the waitress, who eyed her with a mix of curiosity and pity. As she sipped the bitter drink, her phone buzzed incessantly. She hesitated, then pulled it out, her stomach churning as she saw the notifications flooding in. Social media was ablaze. The video of her meltdown at the HOA meeting had gone viral. Clips of her screaming, her face twisted in rage, were being shared thousands of times. The comments were ruthless. "Karma's a basketball, huh?" one user quipped. "Margaret Hamilton, the Karen who Karen too hard," another wrote. "Shaq just dunked on her whole life," a third added, accompanied by laughing emojis. Margaret's hands shook as she scrolled, her vision blurring with tears. She had become a meme, a cautionary tale, a punchline. Her once untouchable reputation was now reduced to a hashtag. # Hamilton humbled. She slammed her phone down, the sound echoing in the quiet diner, drawing a few glances her way. She didn't care. The world had already seen her at her worst. Meanwhile, back in the neighborhood, the atmosphere was electric. Shaq stood on the steps of the newly christened Hamilton Community Center, surrounded by cheering families, volunteers, and local leaders. The grand opening was in full swing, the air filled with laughter and music. Kids ran through the halls, their excitement palpable as they explored the new space. A mural of Shaq dunking a basketball adorned one wall, a playful nod to the man who had turned Margaret's spite into something beautiful. "This isn't about me," Shaq said, addressing the crowd, his deep voice carrying effortlessly. "This is about y'all, about giving back, about making sure everyone has a chance to shine." The crowd erupted in applause, their gratitude evident in every smile and cheer. As the celebration continued, a reporter approached Shaq, microphone in hand. "Mr. O'Neill, what do you say to those who think this was just about revenge?" Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, this wasn't revenge. This was justice. Margaret tried to take me down, but in the end, she destroyed herself. I told her to clean up her mess. Now I cleaned it for her." His words were met with cheers and laughter, the crowd eating up every word. But as the festivities carried on, a shadow lingered at the edge of the property. Margaret, her face hidden beneath a scarf and oversized sunglasses, watched from a distance. Her heart ached as she saw the joy she had never been able to bring to her own home. For the first time, a flicker of regret pierced through her anger. She turned away, disappearing into the night, her future uncertain. Back at the community center, Shaq glanced toward the spot where she had stood, a faint frown crossing his face. He knew this wasn't the end. Margaret Hamilton was many things, but she wasn't one to go quietly. Somewhere, somehow, she would try to strike back. And when she did, he'd be ready. As Margaret drove away, her phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a notification. It was a text. The sender's name made her blood run cold. "You thought you could run. We need to talk. MH." Margaret's hands trembled as she stared at the screen. Who was MH? And what did they want from her now? The game wasn't over. It had only just begun.